Good morning. I am Julie Rosenberg from AIDN, the Australian International Development Network. AIDN acknowledges the traditional owners of country throughout Australia, and most importantly, we appreciate their continuing care for and connection to our land, sea and community. I'm doing just a quick introduction to AIDN before handing over to the two stars of the show. The network has been established as a chapter committee of Philanthropy Australia and has the objective of encouraging and facilitating more and better international development from Australians. It has been a difficult time in Australia, no doubt. With the drought, bushfires and COVID, it would perhaps be reasonable and easy to turn our gaze inwards. But we believe at AIDN that now is the time for us to be looking up and outwards as well. We are interested in growing the sector as a whole, but we also believe the international development needs a louder voice. We are hoping that the network will contribute to that louder voice by providing a more coordinated space to come together and engage and discuss what influence we can have as a group. We are really interested to hear your thoughts and ideas on the direction that we should take and how we can together strengthen the narrative. It is not always easy to see the value of supporting a network or ecosystem, but we have been extremely lucky with our supporters. We have the Cubit Family Foundation, the Dawn Wade Foundation, Vazadara, and now Ripple Foundation. And I just wanted to take a moment to acknowledge and thank them for their foresight. Okay, let's get going. It's so good that you could join us today for our second worst webinar, as our chair, Simon Lewis, would say. Mark Cubit will be interviewing Starr, known to me only as the rock star. And today they will be exploring scale and impact. Mark needs little introduction. He is an extremely experienced and, in my opinion, dedicated international development practitioner. Mark had a very successful career in finance with Merrill Lynch before moving to the for-purpose sector in 2003. He spent 3 years with the Smith family and spent some time on local NGO board positions before turning his focus to international issues. And when I say focus, I mean focus. Focus he did. Mark only gets busier each year. He is chairman of the East African Fund, working to fund the School of St Jude's in Tanzania. He's trustee of both the Cubit Family Foundation and the Planet Wheeler Foundations, and has founded Partners for Equity and AIDN. Mark travels at least 2 months a year to monitor and mentor projects around the world to inform his practice and decision making. I will leave Mark to introduce the rock star, and I am really looking forward to listening to them both. On logistics, I invite you to use both the chat and Q&A functions. Rachel English, an AIDN committee member, will bring her own diverse social sector experience to monitoring the chat and coordinating your questions. Rachel is the Foundation Manager at Mutual Trust, a Director of the English Family Trust, and Co-Chair for Nexus Australia, another very busy person. Finally, I just want to say a quick thank you to the questions we've received prior to the session. This always helps us to make sure that what we are discussing is relevant to you. Okay, over to you, Mark.
Thank you, Julie, and good morning, listeners, viewers, Zoomsters, whatever the correct term might be. Our guest today is Kevin Starr. Kevin leads the Mulago Foundation, a San Francisco-based foundation supporting approximately 50 organisations. There's absolutely no doubt that Kevin is one of the thought leaders in this industry. Mulago funding is unrestricted, minimal hassle, and continues as long as they believe there's momentum towards impact at scale. The foundation is unabashedly obsessed with impact. They design for it, they measure it, they invest in it, and they take it to scale. Kevin's also a regular contributor to the Stanford Social Innovation Review, to PopTech, to TEDx, to School.org. He's also spent 6 hours on Zooms already today with one of their fellow seminars, so I'm absolutely sure he's thrilled to have another hour of Zoom with us. Kevin and I have known each other for over 8 years now. We're both members of Big Bang Philanthropy, and we can talk more about that later on. So Kevin, you're an ER doctor. Today, 25 years on, you're talking to a bunch of Aussies about philanthropy and why scale matters. Fill in the gap for us. What happened over those 25 years?
Well, first, I'm not an ER doctor, and just in the sense I haven't touched a patient in about 8 years now. But it's a long and kind of unusual story. I was in my second year of med school. I got it in my head to start a project in the mountains of Peru. I got connected to a guy named Rainer Arnhold, who's a pediatrician whose family, when he was young, they'd escaped the Nazis from Eastern Germany. And Rainer had worked in every major humanitarian crisis of the 60s and 70s, and he kind of took me under his wing. And we became good friends. And we were working together in Bolivia in 1993 when he died suddenly of a massive stroke. And in the aftermath of that, I get to know his family. And it turns out they unbeknownst to me, that his brother and the family in general had been the family had been in banking for generations. And his brother was a sort of legendary investor, now financier in New York, who'd actually taught George Soros how to do it for 10 years before George launched his own fund. And they decided they wanted to launch a foundation to carry on Reiner's work. And since I knew Rainer so well, they asked me to help out. And over time, it got so interesting that it just sort of took over from medicine. And so when I started doing this, I had no idea how to do philanthropy or even really what philanthropy was. And the one smart thing I did was I just hit the road. I was doing ER, so it was really easy to schedule big chunks of time. And I would just go searching for stuff that worked. And even though I didn't really know what I was doing, I noticed three things. I noticed, one, that stuff I was seeing didn't seem like it had been designed. It was more like collections of accumulated activities. And nobody was really measuring stuff in a way I was used to seeing as a doctor. And then even though I didn't know a thing about business, it just didn't seem like things were being run. The management just didn't seem like it was professional or run along business lines. And at the same time, I developed this mentor, this guy, Carl Taylor, who started, this legendary figure who started the Department of International Health at Johns Hopkins University. And Carl would characterize his life's work as searching to create lasting impact at scale, lasting change at scale, is how he said it. And that just captured my immediate imagination. And then we just built this organization to try to deliver that vision in San Francisco. And now we're 8, and I find it pretty amusing that the most common degree on our team is an MBA.
Okay, so can you tell us, let's first unpack a little bit about your team. How many of you there? You're based in San Francisco. Tell us about the foundation. How many organizations do you fund? Where do you fund? Tell us a bit about that.
Yeah, well, so our mission as a funder is to meet the basic needs of the very poor. And so our fundamental methodology is to try to find organizations that address the basic need of the very poor: health, education, livelihoods, agriculture, and now an increasing number of things around even safety, and fund them over time toward the goal of getting them to real scale. So there's 8 of us, and we do about $25 million a year in grants and a fairly small number of impact investments. And then that includes, like you mentioned, about 50 organizations, but we also have a fellows program that's actually the major on-ramp to our portfolio. And that's become 40 fellows at a time that we're working with.
Okay, so, and to you've mentioned already, so impact is important to you. What is impact, and how do you measure it?
Well, in our case, impact is a measurable change in people's well-being over time. And so what we do, the way we really measure it, and it's kind of a work in progress across a portfolio because it's never perfect. But the first thing we do is we figure out what an organization set out to accomplish. So we have a tool we call the 8-word mission statement, which gives us a precise sense of the target population and the big outcome they're trying to achieve, like get farmers out of poverty, get kids educated in Africa, save coral reefs in the South Pacific. It's just super clear. And then we try to figure out what's the best metric, the simplest, best metric to capture that. And then we try to figure out what's the best way to get high quality numbers that show a change. You know, what's a big enough sample size to bother with? What are the state-of-the-art surveying methods? And then finally, and this is the toughest one, is make sure it was you. In other words, you need to do what they like to call the counterfactual. You need to try to figure out what would have happened without you, because your impact is the difference between what happened with you and what would have happened without you. And that is the toughest part always of measuring impact, is figuring out what would have happened without you.
Does that mean then to follow through with what you want to measure, that you would always prefer to have something like an RCT, a random controlled trial, to measure what happens without the group that you're funding being in the field?
Well, when we deal with things often that are in a state of what we call R&D, where the solution is really being developed and understood. And at that point, what we're looking for is kind of a net sum of things that give what we call a persuasive case for impact. So you've isolated out that you're trying to save children's lives, and you're drawing from methodologies that have been proven otherwise. You're seeing behavior change that you know is linked to an impact in terms of kids' lives. Maybe you have some other supporting information, much of which comes from your own data. And so to us, that justifies moving ahead and growing, replicating your own model. But before things scale up, we believe really strongly that they should have rigorous evidence. And an RCT isn't always the best way to do it, but very often it is, and designing it right and carrying it out right is a critically important task, and asking the right question with it, because we've seen big RCTs even get the question wrong.
So would that mean, let's take an example, a human rights group would be someone that would be difficult for you to fund because it's more challenging to measure their impact?
It is, and advocacy organizations are harder, but the question I always ask is, what's the theory of change? Who exactly do you want to do what differently, and how well connected is that to the outcome that you're working toward? And how are you going to observe that those behaviors happened? And that actually often provides a really good place to start, if not a conclusive place to end. And with let's say you got some organization that's really trying to create policy change that improves human rights. What I would want them to do is make the case that we have a bunch of policy changes that we can persuasively say will move the needle, and then we go after those policy changes, and over time we have a track record where we can't say exactly which part of it was us, but again and again, we seem to be taking on these policy changes, and it's happening. And I think we can make a persuasive case that we played a role. Now, Mulago doesn't really do that. So it's something I've talked to people a lot about, but I haven't tried. And
you have an environment portfolio as well. Is it more difficult to measure impact there?
Not really. It's bedeviled the whole sector that they haven't done it nearly enough, but I don't think it's really that much harder. But you have to, often environmental change takes a long time, so you don't really get the end impacts. But if forests are burning down and you show the behavior change, if people quit setting fire to the forest, it's pretty persuasive that you're going to have a long-term impact if that behavior lasts.
So So it strikes me you've got a very well developed thought process there that really comes back to keeping it simple. With the 8-word mission statement, just trying to just in a straightforward manner look at what those outcomes are. You also look at scale, or I think scale is a key focus for you. Is it fair to say if something can't be scaled, you're not interested in funding it?
Yeah, and that's not a judgment on things that aren't scalable. There's a lot of projects that we think are totally worth doing. We saw our niche as trying to understand what it means for stuff to scale up and focus in on that. And we saw that as the most efficient use of our resources. So yeah, that's been our obsession for a long time.
Yeah, okay. Yeah, so scale to you doesn't mean a large hospital, a large school with 2,000 students. You're looking at more replication. Is that right?
Well, if there's a model embedded in that hospital and a whole approach to hospitals that could be replicated and create big impact at scale, we certainly would. We funded an organization called Mass Design that had some revolutionary ideas on how to create an impact-based hospital that in and of the design of the building, you were actually improving health just through better ventilation and all kinds of things. And that was one hospital initially, but boy, we thought that could scale up. Or it might be a school that doesn't educate that many pupils, but it turns out to be a lab that generates an approach that could help a zillion students. That's exciting to us.
Gotcha. Yeah, yeah. So, so let's take was it Mass Hospital? Did that one work out for you as a funder? And are they still active? Has the concept worked?
You know, it didn't end up being a fit because we were really excited about the idea of just focusing in on that hospital design and trying to make it the way, say, public hospitals were built in all of Rwanda and then beyond. And they were an architectural firm, and they wanted to do a lot of different things, all of which were interesting and admirable. I mean, even like that famous museum about commemorating all the lynching victims in Mississippi, that was there. So they decided they had all kinds of interesting things to do, and they weren't obsessed with getting that to scale. So we wished them well, but it wasn't a funding fit anymore.
So you prefer groups that are pretty much focused on one outcome. Is that fair to say?
Yeah, it's interesting. I mean, we almost think of them like products, and most organizations can do one thing really well, and we'd like to see them take that thing to scale. And sometimes we get an organization that can take multiple things to scale, so just fine as long as we're seeing that progress.
Yeah, yeah, okay. Kevin, you've talked in the past also about replication. I think your argument is, well, where's the long-term story here? We've got a school, we've got a hospital, but in 20 years, 30 years, sort of, so what? Are there going to be more schools, or who's going to be the doer here? Who's going to be doing or building more schools? Who's going to be paying to run those schools? Can you talk through your doer and payer concept?
Well, the doer at scale is whoever replicates the model that you're doing now that you've been able to show has a lot of impact. So it's really about defining what is the model here that is really creating impact. Like 1 Acre Fund, their model was we provide agricultural inputs and training and market access all on credit to smallholder farmers. And so they took that and they've now replicated their own model up to a scale of 1 million families. We're curious, okay, if that worked for you, who else is going to do it? Because there's 100 million farmers at least in Africa and hundreds of millions more beyond if they need this solution, who's going to get it to them? That's the doer at scale.
Have they been able to find other doers outside their organization?
Well, you know, what's so interesting about those guys is they didn't intend to do that. They haven't put a lot of effort into that, but the attention their model has gotten has generated a lot of imitators, some of which are now for-profit companies, seeing if they can do it. And then a lot of other people are trying to apply state-of-the-art tech to it to see if they could make it cheaper to deliver. So when we stepped back from it, we realized, oh yeah, there are a lot of doers at scale here. They're just different. They're doing variants of it, but they're doing those core elements of inputs and training on credit.
Does a successful model that is One Acre Fund, I mean, it clearly must be successful if they're now serving 1 million farmers. Do you find that model often gets diluted when it's copied by other players?
I mean, it's especially in the NGO sector, that's often a problem. Interestingly, in this case, it's often been improved because people have innovated on it. So that's been really exciting to see that maybe some people are going to do an even more cost-effective approach to the whole thing. But often that's the big problem with doer at scale. If a government takes up your solution, they don't do it right, or if an NGO takes up your solution, they try to do it on the cheap or in half the time, or they're just not that good at what they do.
Okay. Could you talk a little bit about MyAgro? Because am I right in saying they're a group who took the 1 acre model and put a twist on it?
Yeah, that's a beautiful example. So the founder of MyAgro actually worked for 1 Acre Fund. And she had this idea, maybe it's better if we can help people save up the money for inputs and training. It's still financing, but it's saving. Maybe they'll get even better results. So she went off to Mali to give it a go. And I think it's really been in what we would think of as R&D for a long time, which is fine by us as long as we're seeing a path ahead. And yeah, it may turn out to be over time. She's still trying to get her costs down, but it might turn out to be a more cost-effective way to get the same impact. Cost-effective for the funder, and maybe certainly it might increase the profits of the farmer because they're not having to pay any interest. But we don't really know. All we know is they're starting to get some of the same results with farmers that we saw with 1 Acre Fund.
So these models, they're probably developed to where the farmer who is paying for the inputs, and the inputs would be fertilizer, seeds, training, is paying 60, 70, 80 cents in the dollar for the product. The balance is coming from a donor subsidy. Are you okay with that, if we call it a donor subsidy, continuing off into the future, or to you, does it have to get to paying for itself eventually?
No, I feel like most of the things that really benefit the very poor need to be subsidized.
Okay. Yeah.
And we're okay with that as long as the cost that subsidy represents, we're impressed with it.
Gotcha. So you're looking for the bang for buck or the value for money argument there. Yeah. Okay.
Yeah.
Let's talk about the role of government as the payer. Does that ever happen?
Oh yeah. I mean, the government is the key provider of basic services for the poor. Whatever else we might think of governments, that's what they do. And increasingly, we're trying to aim toward models that can, where the government can become the doer at scale.
Yeah.
And we're learning some hard lessons. If you think of governments and the budgets they allocate, they come from taxes, some combination of taxes and big aid. And if that big aid is unstable and you're designing for government as payer, and the fashion in big aid moves away from HIV, or it moves away from smallholder farmers, or whatever it moves away from, you're left, you and the government as partners to try to get this done at big scale by government, you're left holding the bag. So I'm really, when one of our fellows is thinking about government being the payer at scale, we're looking at that particular government that they're interested in, saying, are they going to pay this with their own money or with aid? And if it's with their own money, I'm more excited about it. And sometimes we have to rely on aid, and that's a little scarier.
So, so you see private philanthropy as being more reliable than big aid, and you don't get excited when big aid jumps into a project by the sound of it, because you're afraid they might jump out again 3 years later.
Yeah, it's always a worry, but I want to be sure and say that rarely is philanthropy a payer at scale. Philanthropy is for getting stuff going.
Yeah.
And for proving it, and providing for enough replication so that we really know if it's worth scaling and if it's scalable, but then there's got to be a handoff.
Yeah. Yeah, that's probably a key point. Philanthropy is for getting stuff going. Yeah. Could you talk about Bridge Academies in Liberia? Because I think that's been a fascinating journey for you. You've been one of the instigators of a large project there. It's
yeah.
how's that going?
Well, it's an interesting story because it was a constantly a shifting goalpost and even shifting game. Because Ellen Sirleaf asked Bridge to come in. Their education system was an utter shambles. They had 40% of the kids in the country, 60% of the kids in the country were out of school entirely. A girl in 5th grade could read one word in a sentence. I mean, it just was awful. And so she's getting near the end of her term. She's kind of desperate to show progress. She says her education minister learns about Bridge, visits Bridge. She says, Bridge, will you come in and run some schools for us as an experiment? So it's going to be 50 schools. And then Bridge is they're a controversial bunch. So then there was a big fuss, and then it turned out, well, let's get a bunch of operators. So then there was 7 operators, many of whom had never worked in Liberia, many of whom had never run more than one school even. And so they launched this thing called Partnership Schools for Liberia, and damned if it didn't work pretty well. And it was all philanthropy, with the idea we want to prove this, and if it works, it should be scaled up, maybe even across the whole country, with the best providers moving forward. And I actually think it was controversial, and there was a big hassle over the researchers who did the randomized control trial that in my view was launched way too early, and in my view it shows way better results than they presented it as. But all that aside, this thing seems to work pretty well. But here's the kicker that kind of illustrates what we were talking about earlier. The key problem in Liberia, they spend $50 a kid on education. You know, in America, we spend $8,000. Kenya spends $270. Even Guinea, which is poor as hell up north, spends 110. So you could actually do this initiative if you spent about 110 or 120 bucks per kid. That isn't even on the horizon for Liberia. So I'm kind of convinced, looking back at it, that we've learned a ton, but this thing is still dependent on philanthropy in year 5. I don't think that Liberia is actually going to pay for it. They don't have the money. And Big Aid hasn't stepped up. And USAID is sort of this funder that everybody sees as kind of responsible for Liberia. And so they're not funding it. So it's almost like a blocking function.
Gotcha. So it's still feasible that might succeed. Like, can it just wait until big aid comes over the horizon? US aid comes over the horizon. Liberian government finds the money. Is that?
Well, right now it's not expanding.
Yeah.
It's just kind of puttering along at the same level, and some wonderful philanthropists are keeping it going. And maybe next year, maybe the next year, maybe the next year, some big aid player will step in, maybe with one of these really innovating, development impact bond kind of schemes.
Yeah.
I hope so. But what's really interesting is that two of the most successful players, Bridge and Rising Academies, are now doing this in other places. And this could spread outside Liberia, and to my mind, that's a pretty great success if it happens.
Yeah. Well, that is exciting. Private philanthropy, it feels to me like that could even end up as big as big aid. Like groups like Co-Impact are starting to throw a lot of money around. Can you tell us what you're seeing on that front? It feels to me like maybe they'll even replace the traditional big aid one day.
It'll be hard. Like if you look at Audacious, which is another one of these big funds, it's a bunch of really, really rich guys deciding on priorities and deciding what's good and throwing money at it. And I don't know, it's okay. Co-Impact is more coherent, where they're saying, yeah, we want to find solutions that can scale and bring funders together around scaling specific things. That starts to make more sense. But there's not that much, that's not that much meaningful coordination in I'm starting to call it big philanthropy. And some of it's really well done, and some of it is capricious, and it basically suffers from or basically has the same weaknesses and strengths as those of us in littler philanthropy.
Right. Yeah. There's always the challenge. Yeah. At Mulago, how long do you fund your partners for? Some foundations we only fund for 3 years because our role is just to start things off, as you might put it. There's all these sort of rules that seem to get put around it. How do you view that at Mulago?
Well, we tend to get in early, just because of the way that we take on social entrepreneurs with our fellows program, typically at a pretty early stage. And then we keep funding as long as we see the progress toward this distant dream of scale. And we accompany them on the journey because A, it's fun, and B, we learn a lot, and C, why would you get out of an investment that's paying off? We put a lot in, we take the risk early, and we put a lot into that. And so if it succeeds and is succeeding, we want to keep funding it. And that gives us legitimacy to start bringing others in good faith. So it's not clear to us why anybody would quit. We are going to try to start moving more of our money earlier, just because we're good at working with early stage organizations, and that's often when the money, when they most desperately need it, when it can breed more money. So we're kind of shifting to sort of have our funding have more of an arc, but we don't have any plans to get out.
Can you define that early stage for me in terms of a dollar budget or whatever? What would be the budget of one of the smallest organizations you might fund?
It's funny because I don't really think in terms of budgets. I think of where they are functionally. So, everybody starts with an idea. Like, Andrew Yoon of One Acre Fund, I recruited him as a fellow after I watched him in a business plan competition, and he had no employees yet.
Wow. And now he's got 1 million funds and 8,000 employees or something like that. Yeah, okay.
Something crazy, but I actually love to get involved. They're usually, God, Laura looked at this. I can't remember, but increasingly we're getting people in who have a closer to $1 million budget, but you know, if the idea looks good enough and the person is impressive enough, we'll get in crazy early.
Yeah.
Because then there's the most potential for us working together and maneuvering over time to find the thing that's most likely to work and scale.
We often find that the ideas that perhaps present the best in that initial package might have been written by some smart young thing who's done an MBA at Yale or something like that. On the other hand, we can't help thinking that really the ideas that'll work on the ground, you know, should be coming from someone in Africa, in Liberia, in Kenya. They do, of course, have the ideas, the knowledge, the skill, and the ability, but they seem to struggle to get as much funding as someone from the US or from Australia. How do you handle that challenge? Do you find you have to just look that much harder to find the local players?
Well, again, I don't think of it quite that way. It's sort of, if something's going to be designed, it needs to be designed in the middle of those who it's intended to use it, intended to be benefited by it. At the same time, we need to bring in the best design methodologies from across the world. These local people don't have a window into that. And then we need to bring the best ideas and technologies to them. And then everything gets developed in a local context through a process that's based locally. So you end up with this best of literally both worlds model or product. It makes no sense for people to sit in a village and think up something in the absence of the best ideas out there. It makes zero sense to bring in ideas from outside and think they're going to work without going through a local lens. Gotcha.
So the ideas can be global, but the working up of those ideas needs to be done locally. That's what you're saying. Yeah. Let's. Can we talk maybe a few of the success stories in your portfolio? And I think we discussed earlier a list that of groups, they do have tax deductibility in Australia, so we might gravitate around them. But be it Bomber Project, One Acre you've already mentioned, or Healthy Learners, Integrate Health, Last Mile Health, Muso, One Heart Worldwide. Firstly, I think all of those groups, they've worked up their ideas in country, haven't they?
Yeah, they really have. Now, they're not local leaders in the sense that the CEO of almost every single one of those organizations is not really from the country. I mean, Raj Punjabi of Last Mile Health left Liberia when he was like 4. But they have, the vast majority of the employees are from the country where the work originates and happens. And the senior team really represents the local populace, the national populace, and they're all developing toward higher and higher percentage of people in these roles. But you know, Last Mile Health, and you mentioned a lot of people know them. That's been really fun. So when we met Raj Punjabi, they had this isolated project way out in the middle of nowhere in Liberia. And they were trying to do everything. They were raising honeybees. They were treating mental illness. They were trying to do some microcredit. And then they had these health workers where, for a change, they were really paying them and they were mentoring them and they were coaching them and supporting them and supplying them well. And they were trying to make health professionals out of them in a setting where there weren't any doctors. And we got to know Raj and we said, hey, Raj, you can't do all that stuff. You can't do all that stuff well. You're going to be stuck as a project. But this professionalized health worker idea, this thing this thing has legs. We think this could go big. And we didn't push him into that. We just sort of gave our opinion, and Raj kind of starting to think the same way. And so he focused in on that, because there's been a huge world history of community health workers as volunteers, and its track record has been abysmal. And somebody needed to say, these guys got to get paid, and they got to be recognized and treated like professionals. So then Raj started building that idea out, and that started to get some attention, and then they started to expand, and then they very early on really connected with the Ministry of Health. The Ministry of Health gets really interested, and damned if they don't get written in, their idea doesn't get written into the National Health Plan. And now these community health assistants are going to go big. What?
We're back to your concept of the payer here, the Ministry of Health getting involved.
Well, first of all, they're the doer, right? So they're actually going to field a zillion of these community health assistants, they now call them. And because it's Liberia, Big Aid is going to need to pay for it. But now this idea of the professionalized health worker is taking off all over the place. And so I think it's the most exciting thing that's happened since I started doing Mulago.
Yeah, it's certainly where the weight of our portfolios have gone. Groups like Musul in Mali, and now moving into Cote d'Ivoire, Integrate Health in Togo, and all these groups, they work together, they collaborate, don't they? They share ideas. They've worked out a model, and very much doing it out there in the last mile. Kevin, to digress for a moment though, when I flew, took 32 hours for me to get to Monrovia in Liberia, and then drove 5 hours to visit Last Mile Health. Got to their guest house, got to my room. There's my bed, which was more than welcome, but there was a surfboard in my room. And I said, what's with the surfboard? And they said, it's Kevin Starr's. Got to digress and ask, what was your surfboard doing in my bedroom in the backwoods of Liberia?
It's a widely known secret that Liberia has world-class waves. And so I was actually really happy when it looked like there was going to be something fundable in Liberia. And I actually took a board with me my first trip there. And it was so good. I thought, I'm coming back to this. I'm coming back to Last Mile Health. I'll just stash this here because it's a pain in the ass to cart surfboards all over the world. And it was kind of an old beat up one, so I just left it there. Okay. And then, I don't know, it came kind of a totem in that room for some reason.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, at least that's my favorite answer of the session anyway. Kevin, so we met eight years ago when you had the idea to form Big Bang Philanthropy. Could you talk a little bit about that and what you were seeking to achieve there?
Well, so I mean, we realized. I'll say it wasn't just me. We realized that a bunch of us had already been talking and funding together informally and without structure for a while. We talked to each other all the time. And so we thought, well, what if we gave this just enough structure to facilitate funding together, with everybody making their own funding in their own way, their own decisions in their own way, but acting more in concert and just make it easier to hear about great stuff and to have space to pitch stuff to each other, and then maybe grow it out. And you had the best idea of all, which is that rule one is a minimum of rules. And that's a lot of what's made it work. But what we had was, we said, okay, to be a member, you got to be funding, and now you got to be funding 5 organizations in common to assure that we're all aligned and going in the same direction. And you need to have $1 million a year skin in the game. And it's been extraordinary. I mean, I think when we started actually measuring the the money that was apparently co-funded, it's gone from like 7 million to north of 50 million now. And that's without any real hassle, no real structure, one half-time manager. What do we got? Like 18 members now? 18 funders? Yeah, and it's a bunch of friends. It's all, you know, these things, when they work, they're based on a certain structure and they're based on personal relationships. And we meet at least once a year. We did before all this hit. And it's a 2-day meeting, but it gets us talking together all year and going to the field together.
Yeah, exactly. It's it works, doesn't it? It hasn't been over-engineered. It's a loose framework, but we know where to find each other and where to get the answers to all of our questions. Yeah. Well, some of our questions, I should say. Yeah. Hey, Kevin, I'm going to hand over to Rachel English now. Rachel has been curating questions from the floor. There's 85 people out there in Zoom land. So Rachel, over to you for some. I'm sure Kevin. I'm sure they're all waving back as well. Yeah, Rachel, over to you for the questions.
Thanks, Mark. Thank you, Kevin. I feel almost like I just want to spend 20 minutes asking my questions and just ignoring everybody else, but that's not a very good team player attitude. So I'm trying to bundle together a few different questions so we can address as many as possible in the time we've got. But Mulago seems to strike this balance between deeply focusing on assessment and measurement and impact, but also being untied funders without using proposals and, you know, too much paperwork for organizations. And so how do you find that balance of not adding too much work for, you know, the doing organizations, but still being confident that there are outcomes there?
Yeah. So one is we fund organizations, not projects. So we decide, is this organization doing something we really want to support? And then we also don't fund organizations that aren't persuasively measuring their own impact, because that's the first reason to measure impact. I mean, imagine a business trying to get together to get better at what it did if it didn't measure profit. You know, it'd just be a mess. And we believe the exact same thing is true about impact. So, you know, we look for a culture of rigor and curiosity around impact. So if an organization isn't measuring impact first and foremost for its own sake, for the sake of those they serve, we're not interested. And it ain't going to be perfect when we encounter them. It can be a mess, but the intent and the willingness to learn has to be there.
Nice. And a bit of a bundle around building relationships with organizations in places that are overseas. You know, what's your advice for selecting of local implementing partners, and how much time do you spend in country sort of assessing and building those relationships, but also, you know, how much input do locals have in those programs compared to things ultimately being expat-led, you know, being white people coming into countries and sort of trying to lead programs that aren't necessarily locally focused?
Yeah. So we have a real advantage there because our on-ramp is the fellowship, and the fellows get $50,000 a year for 2 years, and we work with them really closely, and we're not trying to judge their work, we're just trying to move it forward. And then at some point we need to make a judgment about whether there really is a scalable idea, and whether, given the fact that we've gotten to know this person, do we actually think and we've gotten to know the senior team, which is even more important than the person. Do we think they have the chops to do this? And I almost always get to see them in the field during their fellowship. And if they're, you know, what we call a gringo, a white person from the US or Europe or Australia or New Zealand or something, we want to know how dialed in are they locally, and who are the people who are really running the stuff on the ground. And if that isn't a very strong local presence and local influence. I mean, that's, you know, impact is still impact, and you got to measure stuff, but that's a big red flag. That's a problem if they're not dealing with it, because we simply know that stuff doesn't work without that. So this isn't an ideological thing for us, it's a practical thing. And, you know, if it turns out that the person from say even a corporate background in the US actually knows how to build an organization and run it, and they've got the right people actually doing the stuff on the ground, we're fine with that. You got to build an organization, but you've got to deliver for the people you serve first and foremost. And so we think of it as, we look at a job and you got to have the right person for that job at the right time. And many of those jobs require a local person. And it's got to be a super competent local person who really understands what they're doing. But it's really important to look at a job and say, who is the right person at the right time for this job?
Could you build out a little bit on like the fellowship program? What does that look like? It sounds like that's sort of an on-ramp for a lot of the organizations that you ultimately support and have these long relationships with. What does the fellowship program look like, Kevin?
So we tap a big network that's really been developed over many years, and includes, you know, a lot of people like Mark, who know what we're looking for and feed us suggestions. It's become almost all referrals, although we hear about stuff when we're traveling, or we hear about stuff when we're at events, or we hear about stuff in random conversations. But our fellows, alumni, those people in our portfolio, feed us a lot. And then our Big Bang colleagues feed us a lot. And then our colleagues like the Draper Richards Kaplan Foundation, who does a lot of what we do in the US, feeds us a lot. So it ends up being quite a broad referral base. And then we get promising names, we look at what they do, and finally we select 10 each year that who we think have a really promising scalable idea, and who we think are entrepreneurs who could really grow it. And then we have a week-long course where we teach them the basic Mulago approach to design for impact and strategy for scale. And then we start bringing in people from real experts to talk about building the organization, stuff like hiring and developing talent, raising money, building basic systems, and just try to give them, basically I think of it as design for impact, strategy for scale, and really important tips on building an organization. That's what we deliver in a week. And then we stay in close touch over the year. I have, like, for example, I have regular office hours, and they basically just drop in by Zoom to those regular office hours. And I really try to get out into the field, and basically the rest of the team does something similar. We basically say you get all the advice you can eat, and it's kind of up to them to pull it in.
And I've got a few questions here around sort of the length of funding relationships. Now you said that philanthropy is for getting something going, but then sort of it needs to be handed off. But then, you know, Mulago stays with organizations for the long run. So what does the long-term partnership look like for an organization? And is there another more sustainable outcome that doesn't lead you to rely on big aid or philanthropy? Is it growing capacity locally or businesses? Like, what's the goal long-term, I suppose? So
the goal long-term is the distant dream is to say, we want to realize the potential of this idea. And so if you imagine a Venn diagram of the need and where that idea would work, first of all is the overlap of a size that's interesting to us. And then reaching scale is really an endless process of trying to fill in that overlap, of trying to fulfill the potential of that idea. And scaling is making the curve of impact over time steepen and really accelerate toward that distant dream of fulfilling the potential of the idea. So organizations, we think of it as 3 stages. They start in R&D, where they're trying to get to a systematic, replicable model that has persuasive enough evidence that we think it should grow. And then replication, where the organization itself is growing and doing more and more. And then eventually you've got to get it out of just your orbit and into the world with other doers, governments, other NGOs, businesses, using your model to create impact on their own. That's how you really start to get to scale. And our funding is all only unrestricted funding. So it's just whatever they want to use it for. So you could think of it in R&D, they're just a big lab. So they're going to use their funding in a lab function. In replication, they become more like a factory. They become a machine. So you're funding them to help them grow and replicate on their own. And then in scale, they often become sort of an evangelistic, recruiting, and facilitating organization, where they're basically finding the other organizations, governments, or NGOs, and they're recruiting them and teaching them how to do what they do. And that's kind of something that people don't recognize, but it needs to be paid for. People need to really embrace the role and take off. Businesses are a special case. So if we see a for-profit idea, my thinking has changed hugely on this over the last few years. We're looking for, I like Venn diagrams, so I'll create one in the air. We're looking for ideas that have a big addressable market. So there's a lot of people who you could engage and create impact for with a good enough idea. But then the key to business ideas going to scale is that a bunch of other businesses copy your idea, because not one business can't solve a problem. So your business has to be profitable enough to attract imitators. And that's a huge and scary reality, because for too long we've talked about for-profits needing to be sustainable, but who copies a barely break-even business? Nobody. And so given they need a big market and they need to be really profitable, then they have to have the characteristic that impact and profit are aligned, or they'll drift off the poor up into the middle class. And we just see that again and again. And so the overlap of that is pretty small. And it means our for-profit pipeline is generally just a fraction of our not-for-profit pipeline. But ideas that can genuinely scale via the market can be really powerful. There just aren't that many of them that really serve the needs of the very poor.
There's obviously questions around success. Everyone wants to know the success and failures. And you've spoken about a couple of examples of success. Are there any particular countries that you believe have a higher likelihood of success? And what, I suppose, level of failure have you seen across the investments, and has that changed over time?
You know, it's interesting because it really varies by idea. Now, everybody likes to go to Rwanda because it's orderly and stuff works, if you can ignore the fact that it's a police state. And so the sort of orderliness of it attracts a lot of people trying new ideas. And for some good reason, and if stuff works there, maybe it can go on beyond. But in some settings, the more of a shit show it is, the more desperate it is, the more rapidly change can happen. So some ideas do really well in really, not necessarily unstable, but certainly very poor and disorganized settings. So it's all about, you know, creating an animal that can swim in that particular sea. So we don't actually have a favorite country. Although I do like to go to countries where I can leave a board. But you know, Nigeria is super fun to work in because there's so much dynamism. And at the same time, if you try to do certain things in Nigeria, you're doomed because the government, I mean, it's so badly governed that you're not going to scale up very much via government. but you might scale up via the market because it's one of the most entrepreneurial places on earth. So we got a lot of favorite countries for a lot of different reasons.
And Kevin, are you mostly working in Africa? All the countries you're talking about are Africa. They're sort of examples of, work in Latin America or the Middle East or other parts, or do you sort of focus on at least a continent?
We focus on, we're super lucky in that we don't have to be restricted to a geography, and we don't see any reason to be. We need solutions and organizations that benefit the very poor and with something, and are committed to taking their ideas to scale. So we got a really interesting program and organization in Guatemala trying to get widespread adoption of a much more nutritious maize seed. And we've got somebody in Myanmar working to get all kinds of different productivity products to farmers, and everything in between. It just turns out the bulk of the world's very, very poor people are in sub-Saharan Africa. But I'm not even sure if that's true. It's really India, but as a percentage of the population, it's Africa.
What else? I suppose questions around innovation in addressing the needs of the poor. Is that what we need? Do we need more sort of tech innovations to help us scale projects? And does tech have a role to play in the groups that you fund?
Well, the first thing we need is evidence. So we need a way of getting rid of stuff that doesn't work and understanding the difference between what should be replicated and what shouldn't. And then we need replication so successful pilots don't just go nowhere. So I think we need replication at this point more than we need innovation. But of course we need ongoing innovation, and Mulago gets really involved in innovation just because getting involved with those guys are what we've gotten good at, and it's often where we can make the biggest difference. But I would say if I had to choose for the next 10 years between just replicating the good ideas we already have and developing new ones, if I'm honest, I probably would choose replication.
And Kevin, have you ever encountered or funded or tried to identify organizations that are impactful and potentially scalable, yet don't follow the dominant Western model of doing business? It's sort of just, I suppose, very different to business as usual.
There's been, my early mentors worked a lot with sort of a tradition in India, sort of handed out by Gandhi, of village interventions that would sort of spread naturally, that were not spread by some disciplined sort of almost corporate-like organizations. And I just noticed over time that they would have a certain halo around them. They would often spread like some community health worker models. They would spread from village to village for a while, and then they would sort of lose energy at the edges. So you'd end up with a certain radius that they could achieve, but I didn't see them really doing this thing over time. So it's funny, I just don't think Western, non-Western. I just think about stuff that seems to work. And organizations, if I saw an organization that just seemed to be doing stuff that I'd absolutely never seen before with methods that I didn't even understand, but they could show measurable impact that was cost effective and was taking off over time, I don't care. That's wonderful. I would really want to come to understand it, but it could be methods completely unrecognizable to me. I just think sometimes this dichotomy, Western and non-Western, is an artificial one. And we think so much about behavior change because impact comes from behavior. If people don't do anything differently, impact doesn't happen. But So we almost think of ourselves as a bunch of money trying to help people change behavior. And so we get really interested in that, but what we're interested in is the commonalities between all people, not the differences. So yes, culture is a very big deal, but what's more interesting to us is in what ways are we all the same? And what works with tapping into the ways that we're all the same? So I kind of get what people are getting at, and I respect it. We've found it more useful to just focus on what works and not worry about Western and non-Western.
Nice. And last question before I hand back to Mark, we've got 2 minutes maybe. I suppose question around financial inclusion, you know, microfinance certainly seems scalable. Does financial inclusion play a big role in lifting communities out of poverty in your experience?
Not by itself. It turns out that microfinance went huge before they had the RCTs that really asked, are people getting wealthier? Are people really better off? And it turns out, by and large, they're not. It leaves them maybe a little bit better. But then financing assets that really make you more productive is super important. I mean, we got a fellow today that was talking about financing highly effective education. So she screens educational opportunities to the degree to which they'll really get somebody a job, and then finances that, and then gets an income share agreement to get the money back. So financing the poor is super important if you have something really productive to do with that money.
Yeah, excellent. Thank you so much, Kevin. Mark, I reckon we're almost out of time, so I'll hand back over to you.
Right. Okay. Thank you, Rachel, and thank you, Kevin. You're in the middle of 3 weeks with your fellows, which I gather, because they couldn't travel to San Francisco, is happening on Zoom, starting at 6 in the morning for 6 hours each day. And here you are at the end of the day. You've given us an hour and more than an hour of your time. So thank you very much. You tell me you haven't been to Australia yet. We've got to fix that. So make sure you make your way down at some stage. To all of you out there in Zoom land, thank you for listening today. We had 85 sign up for today's call, which indicates both the pulling power of our rock star here, and I think interest in what we're trying to do here at AIDN. Today was our second AIDN webinar. The third is going to be on Friday, October the 9th at 11 a.m. as we celebrate the International Day of the Girl. There'll be a recording of today's conversation available on the website within a few days. Feel free to share it with anyone else that you think might be interested. If you're thinking of giving it as a Christmas gift, that means, like me, you're based in Melbourne, lockdown is getting to you, and you need to get out for a walk immediately after this is over. The Australian International Development Network, we're seeking to foster more and better international development from Australians. That's from you, the audience. It's a network. We're aiming to connect people. That means if you want to get the best out of the network, you have to be a contributor. So email Julie Rosenberg with your thoughts about how this group should move forward. We also still need more financial support. You can help us out there as well. We still need you to spread the word. Help us with the more and better in the international development. This can be your network. Don't be a passenger. So enjoy the rest of your day. Again, Kevin, thank you very much. I know the crowd out there in Zoom land will be applauding like crazy as we sign off. So stay safe, everybody, and enjoy the rest of your day. Thank you.